And welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Ash with Caltech Center for Technology and Management Education. Welcome to the Elevated series. We're going to get started in just a minute. In the chat window, we've got a few notes. Why don't you shout out, announce yourself, let us know where you're from. In the chat, you can also see where on our webpage for Elevated, you can see past programs, download the deck, and register to be notified for new sessions. And feel free to share that with others in the project management community. We welcome folks who've joined us hearing about it through PMI. Hello, Chicagoland, Costa Rica, Massachusetts, Michigan. Fantastic. We're so happy everyone could be here. We're going to give folks just another minute or two, and then we're going to get started. Today we've got Alan Dunn, a longtime friend of Caltech's, and lead in the next generation supply chain leadership programs. Got a really great session today. This is awesome. Rick Hefner, our program director, is also here. And if it's your first time joining the Elevated series, this part is a monthly webinar. We have other content as well. And this is really about advancing your career as a project professional, project leader, project manager, whatever you want to call yourself, even a project member, or friend of the PM community. It's all about exercising your right brain and your left brain, how to be a better professional, how to guide your career. And each month we produce a few different programs. So let's see. Alan, you're almost ready to go, right?
Ready to go.
Okay, just a minute. So if everyone, let us know where you're from. We're really glad you could be here today. There's so many of you. If you have trouble with audio, log out, log back in. Let's see if that helps. And we're going to begin now. So again, my name is Mike Ash. I'm a director in Caltech Center for Technology and Management Education. We're the professional education and executive education arm of the California Institute for Technology. Our role in the Institute is to work with industry on matters of learning programs and workshops for creating better innovators to get folks ready for the future. And we're really glad you're here today. Especially fortunate, you're especially fortunate. Alan Dunn is with us today. Alan has been with Caltech over 30 years and leading our next generation global supply chain programs, other operations programs, leadership coaching. We're going to spend a couple of minutes. We'll set this up, and we're going to turn it over to Alan in a minute, and then he'll present on 3 mental models for productive interactions and influence. So how you can kind of harness these in your own career and for yourself. Then we'll probably reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A tool in Zoom, and we'll try to, if we can, answer them along the way, but we'll definitely hit them up in the end. Okay. If you came in early, I mentioned a little bit about this. We've set up the Elevated series really as a medium for you to not just improve your performance and project outcomes, but also to help guide your career. And I spent over 20 years as a project manager, an analyst in IBM and Deloitte and Monitor at Caltech, really helping companies do magical stuff with new technologies. And how do we create those transformations? So I've been in small projects, large projects, and one of the great ways we frame Elevated for you is it's all about just you're already you've got kind of your rational intelligence, you're smart, you're clever, you're here. What it takes to be a really great project professional is having some emotional intelligence, not just self-awareness, but empathy and understanding of people's behaviors. And then we look to this through a lens of executional intelligence. So it's a little bit of wisdom, it's a little bit of insights from others, thinking about and accessing provocateurs that can kind of spark new ideas, and really being able to harness all three of these makes you a better professional in our perspective. Through this series, like I said, this is monthly on the third Tuesday of the month, and we're here to bring you tools, presentations, worksheets, things you can access, things that can be applied immediately. We thank you for your time and being here. We know it's a big investment, and we won't delay you any longer. So again, Alan Dunn is with us, and we're going to talk about 3 mental models for productive interactions and influence. Alan leads the majority of our custom programs that we do for our clients in leadership development and supply chain management operations. Just really amazing work that he does, and happy to be a collaborator with him over the past many years. So I'm going to stop this. And Alan, I believe you can start your session.
There we go. Thank you, Mike. I hope everybody can hear me. Mike, give me the thumbs up, thumbs down if there's a problem.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all my colleagues at Caltech for allowing me to share some of these ideas with all of you. So, by the way of my background, I've actually managed an enormous number of projects. If I look at the major ones, it's probably a little shy of 200 major projects in my 40-year career. When I say major, I mean design and building of a factory, either onshore or offshore, or transforming a corporation in terms of the way it goes to market or the way it runs its supply chain. In some cases, it's been the actual combination of major facilities. So these are big projects. Of course, there's lots of smaller projects, and these principles that I'm going to talk about today, they address both big and small projects. So even the smallest of projects, you as a project manager or as an aspiring project manager, you are a change agent. And this is one of the things that I think that's really important to understand, is that your job is not just to run a project. Your job is obviously to deliver results. And to deliver results, you have to have a different kind of a mindset. That mindset has to be one of delivering results through other people. You know, I asked a dear friend of mine who's a CEO, I asked him one day, what is a CEO's job? And he said, the CEO's job is to develop people. I said, what else? He goes, that's pretty much it. He said, if you think about a CEO is an individual who gets things done through other people. CEO's most important job is to select and hire and retain the right kinds of people. And so it is with a project manager. In fact, another colleague of mine defined a project manager as a miniature CEO or a CEO in training. And so it's a lot of the same skills. And those skills are not at the tips of your fingers on a keyboard. They're in your brain, or as I like to say, your biological EEPROM up here. So to do that, you need to create some mental models. Now, we all have mental models. You may not actually think you have them, but everybody has mental models. If you're literally over 10 years of age, you have mental models. A mental model itself is really an important way of thinking. It helps you to think. Mental models are kind of a mandate, especially when the rule book runs out almost every day. Now, I come from the supply chain and manufacturing world. And if you don't think in today's global supply chain challenges, post-COVID, or I guess current COVID, if you don't think the rule book changes literally every day, you haven't been thinking about this. I give you an example. This isn't about COVID. This is years ago. A client of mine, they brought in products, mostly roots and grains and things like that from foreign countries in large containers. And they actually had one day to open a container and pour out all the cinnamon root or cinnamon bark, I think it was. And along with the cinnamon bark in their factory came out 2 big snakes. And I remember one of the guys saying to me when I was there, he goes, "Well, we haven't seen that one before. Do we have a policy for how to deal with snakes?" And the answer was no, but we have mental models of how to deal with contaminants. And we have policies about how to deal with contaminants. So we ought to be able to figure this out. This is really important because this is about using our brains. Now let's talk a little bit about a mental model and a little bit more about what a mental model really is. A mental model is a mind construct that you, as project professionals, and indeed any professional, use to guide yourselves, to guide your reasoning, your thinking, your logic, your cognitive approach to a problem. You do this when you're trying to understand something about the surrounding about you, something that might not be the same, might not be repetitive from prior experiences. These mental models really actually help to shape your thinking and processes, and they even, of course, as a result of that, will shape your behaviors. But this is what's really important to understand. A mental model is something that provides a cognitive framework for you. It's kind of a mental Swiss Army knife. It's not designed to cut. The Swiss Army knife is not designed to cut like a perfect, Japanese steak knife. It's not designed to be the perfect screwdriver for that little screwdriver thing that folds out in it. It's not designed to be the perfect saw for that little saw that folds out, but it's designed to provide a way of getting things done. And that's what a mental model is. It's kind of a mental Swiss Army knife that can be pulled from the recesses of your brain, from way back here and also up here as well, and to pull those together when there's things that are confusing you, when the environment around you confuses you, when the problem itself confuses you. So mental models are used, we pull them from our minds to help us think about what we're going to do. Now, mental models are literal, and I don't mean figuratively. This is not figurative speaking here. They are literal, image-centric explanations in your brain that seek to help you understand the world around you and how things are working around you. You can actually call these up from what we refer to as your neural video server. These are actually images that we have. Some of those images are fairly simple. Some of them are fairly complex. But these mental models that we have to build, that we have to nurture, are really all about trying to help you to understand that world. They help you to understand life and the world around you. They try to guide your perceptions and also try to guide your behaviors. Mental models, now, interestingly enough, neuroscience has taught us that mental models are always logical. There's something about the human brain that demands a logical understanding of the world around them, or around a person. Now, if you don't have the proper training, you don't have the proper skills. So a mental model, if you're in Greece and you don't speak Greek, is not going to help you much until you realize that you have hands and you can communicate some things with your hands and with body motions and body language. You understand that means stop, and you understand, this means go. So you can figure out how to at least get around in a minimalistic sort of way in Athens. So they're logical, but they're not always factual. And part of that reason they're not factual is because they rely on certain stimuli, and some people's stimuli doesn't come from education and doesn't come from training, but comes from YouTube and television and other things that have built-in biases, good or bad, into them. There was a study done years ago, and part of this study, it was the University of Chicago. They asked several thousand people what they thought happens in an ER. And what they described, what most people described, is exactly what happens on the show ER, emergency room. They described what they saw on television. They didn't describe either their own private personal experiences in an emergency room or what they had read about or been educated about. And so it's very interesting that their own experiences, their own feelings, their own imagination had been tainted by an artificial media, in this case, a television show. So they're not always based on facts, but at least the underlying logic of an emergency room is for emergencies and not for normal routine things comes through. So they're imperfect. Mental models are imperfect, but that doesn't make them or non-useful. Mental models, some of the interestingly enough, some of the ideas with the most utility in terms of mental models are the ones that are the simplest to understand. And they can be described in simple things. I'm going to describe 3 mental models using very simple Venn diagrams. And these are Venn diagrams that I've used in my entire project management career that I promise you will make a difference in how you approach a project and how you approach a set of problems. So one of the things we want to do with these mental models is we want to use them to help us in the interaction with people and with project delivery and with other associated people associated with the project. So there's 3 mental models that we're going to deal with. There's the impediments decomposition model, the constituents of change model, and the reactions to change model. Now, I tell you, I almost feel like I want to beg people on this to really pay attention to these 3 models, because if you don't follow these, you probably won't become an extraordinary project professional or project manager. Leader probably be a better term. We don't just want to be project managers. We really want to be project leaders. Management is planning, organizing, directing, staffing, and controlling. Sound familiar? Those are things that managers do. Those are things that project managers do. Planning, directing, staffing, organizing, controlling. Those are things you do every day as a project manager. But leadership, now you got to go a step beyond that. You have to find ways to inspire people. You have to find ways to motivate people. You have to find ways to get them to oscillate from the detail to the big picture and back down to the detail again, so they understand context of what they're doing. This is what a leader does. So a leader understands that it's all about people. It's all about how do you motivate, how do you inspire people, and to do that, you have to first understand people. So let's talk about the impediments decomposition model. I love this illustration because this feels like what most projects feel like at the beginning. All we see is speed bumps in front of us. All we see are all the impediments. And we build a network, a diagram, we build a chart, we build a project plan. And we start thinking about how we're going to get over those. And about that 7th speed bump up the way, we have no idea. We call those, by the way, in my project management world, we call those TAMOs. T-A-M-O stands for then a miracle occurs. You can lay out a project plan and not actually understand some steps. You can design a project plan, an approach to a project, and understand that there are some steps in there technically, physically, you have no idea how you're going to solve them. I remember years and years ago at Beach Aircraft, the gentleman who ran the project for the Starship, which was the very first all-composite airplane. And it was a terrible failure in the marketplace for a variety of reasons. We won't go into those here. But I remember the project manager had his network diagram up on the wall. It was beautiful. It was a thing of wonderment. And about every 2 feet on this 25-foot long chart, there was this node that said TAMO, T-A-M-O. And one of them was in between the wing and the fuselage, and it was about how they bond the two together. They had never bonded a wing to a fuselage with both of them made out of carbon. And so I remember it said TAMO, and I asked the project manager, what is that? Because that was my introduction to TAMO. And he said, that stands for then a miracle occurs. We know today, 2 years from now, we have a real challenge. So we know that that's important. I said, where did you come up with that idea? And he said, because I noticed that we kept always addressing the technological problems when we got to them, instead of understanding 2 years in advance that they exist, so we can start the brains moving, so we can start the thinking, start the project, start the experiments. And that's when I realized that there are impediments, but those impediments, if you're honest with yourself and you define them, can be overcome. So there's 4 categories of impediments in this model. I promise you, if you look at every project through the lens of the impediment decomposition model, you will manage the project differently and you will manage it better. These 3 models I'm sharing with you will take you from being a good project manager to an extraordinary one, I believe. Because I believe technically most project managers, I haven't actually met many incompetent project managers. I've mostly met very smart, very skilled people, but mostly in that top bubble there, the top circle in the technical aspects of project management. And so there's technical, there's organizational, and there are cultural and behavioral impediments to almost any endeavor that you take on, whether it's a project or whether it's running a business or whether it's transforming an operation. There are technical, there are organizational, there are cultural, or there are behavioral impediments or aspects of the project. And you have to identify those up front. Now, the technical aspects of a project are around the technologies, the hardware, the software, the equipment, the applications, the technical enablers, the process, the policies, the procedures, the methodologies. These are all things that we technically create, usually a function of capital and time and some innovative thinking. The first 2 being really big and capital being enormously important here. And so the technical challenges of a project or technical mechanisms of managing a project are really only one of 4 views of that project. Let's talk about the organizational now. The organizational is what is needed to manage and to lead people in this project or this program. How do I need to structure the project? And by the way, if I'm going to implement something, how do I need to reorganize the business, the enterprise itself? What's the work content design? Who's going to do what? So I remember several years ago, a client of mine moved from kind of the material requirements planning, MRP, sort of ordering and replenishment system in their supply chain to a just-in-time Kanban type of a system. In those type of systems, the purchasing department doesn't release orders to the suppliers. There's some sort of Kanban or replenishment scheme in place. And so you actually turn over the replenishment requirements to the supplier. Well, if that's the case, then what are all the people who were in purchasing in the past who did that replenishment work, who picked up the phone and called the supplier, said it's now time to send 10 more? But in a just-in-time environment, that's not going to happen that way. The supplier has visibility to your requirements, and he knows, and he or she is going to make that replenishment happen. So their work content's changed. Your purchasing department's work content has changed. Another client, we have an organization requirement inside the engineering department that requires them to actually discuss technology and techniques and ideas with their critical component suppliers. And so they're actually talking not just to the suppliers about typical engineering specification activities, but they're also talking about availability and ability to manage quality and improve yields and throughput and things like that. And so there's different work content that falls into non-traditional sort of functions or departments. And so organizational shifts happen when you're trying to implement something. My very first significant project, I was too young to have been appointed as the leader of this, but I didn't know any better, and apparently the company didn't know any better either. And so my first job was to implement an ERP system. We called it an MRP2 system in those days, but it was an ERP system. And I remember learning very quickly that there were all kinds of duties and responsibilities that had never been done in the company before. So now we have files, computer files, we have master computer files, and we have parameters that drive the way the system works. And I remember thinking, who's in charge of parameters? In the old days, on a card, someone wrote down, something about a part. They wrote down a quality specification. Now they got to put it into the information system. And somebody has to cyclically review that on a periodic basis. And who's going to do that now? And so I remember thinking, I'm not just implementing a computer system, I'm actually changing the way people work. And it dawned on me that I didn't have the skills to do that. And I worked very hard to get those skills and pull in other people that were smarter, brighter, and in most cases older than me to try to help. I realized organizationally workflows would change as a result of that implementation. Now, if you think about it, culture in an organization is that which is really hard to describe, but we actually know a good culture when we see one, don't we? And we know a bad one when we see one. But a culture is important because it's kind of the sum of the attributes that shape or collectively shape how companies as a whole behave. It's about the collective beliefs, the collective values, the collective behaviors, the norms and the reflections that people on a daily basis have, including everything from dress code to how people are hired to how they communicate. I have 2 projects I'm working on right now, and one of them is with a client that is used for communications, uses audio calls only. You can have a video call with them, but nobody will turn on their camera. It's not their culture. I have another client, interestingly enough, in the video equipment business, that you cannot have a voice call. Everything is done by video conferencing. These are cultures that drive those businesses. I find when we're training the one on audio to try to get them to turn on their video is nearly impossible. But the video is actually very useful because I could see their lips, I could not interrupt them as much. And so it turns out there's some value to video, but that's not their culture. Cultures are very difficult to change, as you well know. But, if you're going to implement, if you have a project to do something, great, and you can't get people to go along with it, then it's not worth implementing. And I see this all the time where companies spend millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars, for example, on major systems implementation. And I go into the company a year later and everybody's still making decisions off of spreadsheets. Now, I love spreadsheets. I think spreadsheets are, next to double entry bookkeeping, probably one of the greatest inventions, certainly in the financial and accounting world, in the analytics world. I love spreadsheets. I remember when VisiCalc came out, I went out and got that 8-inch floppy disk as fast as I could, and I ran VisiCalc. I remember that. By the way, VisiCalc is in the Smithsonian right now. It's that important to how life changed for all of us. But VisiCalc isn't a tool you run a company on. And yet I still see companies using the modern variants, mostly Excel and things like that, for all their decision-making and all their analytics when they have a lot of the information in their information system. And this, of course, results in people having different views of a problem because they have different data sets. And so that's a cultural issue. You can all day long say that's good or bad or you're being different, but that's a cultural thing that has to be addressed. Why would you put in a big information system if nobody's going to use it? The behavior is about those factors that influence what people do and how they do it. And so behavioral factors include, both learned factors and other kind of external factors. So some of these factors come from the existing state of the world around them. Some people live in a world of frustration. Some people live in a world of inherited problems. Some people live in a world, where they just can't get out of the world that they live in. I think of all of our, fighters and warriors in Afghanistan, or who are not in Afghanistan anymore, but I think about them and I think about they must be frustrated. Well, here's the key, folks. A good project manager never gets angry, never gets mad at somebody who pushes back or who's frustrated. Because you understand, they didn't probably wake up in the morning and say, gosh, I hope to be frustrated today. This is learned behavior from early experiences, could be learned through trials and tribulations, could be learned from prior projects, could be learned. This is so important. I want you to remember what I'm about ready to say. I want all of you, the next time you get frustrated, I want you to say, I need to be intrigued by why that person feels the way they feel, or by the way that person's expressing their doubts or their criticism. I want you to be people, I want you to turn into scientists of humans. I want you to be intrigued by those on the project team or those outside the project and program teams. I want you to be intrigued with and wonder, Why would they react that way? That's really important for you to think about, because you as a project manager aren't just in charge of the project management software. Project management is more than, Microsoft Project. Project management is about people. I always say that project management and economics are very similar. A lot of people think project management is all about project planning and maybe some execution, but it's not. It's about inspiring and motivating people as well. And it's about giving them common direction. It's about giving them common successes. Economics is not a financial science. Economics is a social science. It always has been. Everybody thinks it's all about finance and money, but it's really about social science. It's about why people individually and in groups behave the way they do. And so there's a lot in common here that we need to be thinking about, and you need to be intrigued. You need to kind of be that behavioral scientist running that project. So if you break down all your projects into the technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral elements, impediments. So imagine your network diagram or your project plan or your Gantt chart, and imagine a third dimension coming out that segments them into technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral issues. And believe me, you'll get projects implemented that actually work rather than installed but don't work. So a little quick pop quiz. You don't actually have to answer. There's no button to push or anything. Just do this in your mind. If I asked you what impediment is easiest to overcome, if you said technical, you would be right. The technical impediments are the easiest to overcome. If I ask the question, what category of impediments do most project managers mostly focus, especially engineering projects? They mostly focus on the technical. And if you said technical, you'd be right. But if I asked you what category of impediments really drive project and program success, you would say organizational, cultural, and behavioral. You would not say technical. You would say those other three. So that's why it's important. And that's why this is in a program called Elevated, because we need to think bigger. We as project managers are mini CEOs. Now I have a process or a tool that I use in all of my programs that I teach and all my deliveries and presentations I deliver. I call it my moment of wisdom. Wisdom is supposed to be something that you remember forever. So this is something I want you to remember forever. Successful projects can only be achieved by successfully understanding, I would add mastering all four of these elements, the technical, the organizational, the cultural, and behavioral. And I can't say that organizational is going to take up most of your time. In some companies, it won't, but cultural will. And other companies, behavior will. And in some companies, technical will. And so I can't tell you the magnitude of effort for each of these, but I can tell you this: ignore any one of them at your own project success peril. The second model I want to talk about is this constituents of change model. So I want you to think about this, that everything you put forth to implement, everything you put forth to design, there are four categories of individuals who are eventually going to be involved. There's yourself and your analysts that work for you on the project team. There's the participants, there's the impactants, and the leaders and champions. So we'll start with the analyst and the individual. So these are you and the people working with you on the project team. Usually these are the people who define the process flow, the develop the alternatives. You do the as is, the to be. You rationalize different solutions, whether it's technical or whether it's flow sort of solutions, but you believe in the solution. You're the project team. You're the leads of the project team. You believe in the solution because you've taken a methodical approach, and because you want to be rational, and you've probably worked hard to check your own biases. By the way, that's the sign of a great critical thinker. When we help companies to interview for project management people and professionals, and in fact, indeed, almost any management or leader position, we really examine and look and evaluate very deeply their critical thinking skills. And one of the ways of evaluating a person's critical thinking skills is to try to figure out how hard they work and how much they question their own biases. A person who questions their own biases and who wonders, did I come to that conclusion because I'm biased about some prior experience? There's a great study done years ago And I don't remember the school that did this, but they looked at surgeons, and they found that a surgeon who'd been a surgeon for about 25 or 30 years a doctor rather, did not a single bit better than a doctor right out of their residency programs in terms of diagnosing a difficult to diagnose disease. And part of the reason is that doctors had this thing called the experience trap, which they kept going back to their prior experience, and they would shortcut some of the methodologies, the diagnostic methodologies. Whereas the new doctors wouldn't do that because they couldn't do that. They didn't know any better. And so it turns out that some of our own experiences can cause us to be biased. Just because you managed or got results from a person on a project 7 years ago with a certain technique, that should inspire you, but that shouldn't mandate a return to that technique in that particular environment, because environments change. If we take a look at the participants, these are typically the individuals that we identify or pre-identify early on who are going to be responsible for implementing whatever our project is putting together. These are people who typically take change more seriously. That's why you selected them oftentimes to be an implementer. And they also tend to bring a healthy skepticism, but they're still motivated to get things done. You get the wrong ones, you get the wrong participants, I know them very quickly, because they're going to impede your progress, and they're going to put the change or the project at risk, and they're going to increase the potential for failure. So here's another little bit of wisdom. I don't think this even makes it to a moment of wisdom in this presentation, but select your people for your team carefully. I am a firm believer that project managers should select their own team members, period. I realize sometimes that's not possible, but it's only not possible because of company policies and procedures. Every great project manager I know selects the resources for the project. They don't take necessarily who's available. They go out and they find and they seek and they buy, they persuade, they do whatever they have to do to get the best project participants. I mean, that's what a CEO would do, right? And that's what a miniature CEO or a project manager or program manager should do. And then we have the impactants. Now, don't bother looking that word up in the dictionary. It doesn't exist. I made it up. I admit that. These are the people who are going to be impacted by the project, by whatever this project. So if you're implementing a major new information system in your company, these are the users who are going to be impacted. And so they're going to be willing to tell you that they're impacted. And they tend to be the largest of all the groups of these four. So you may have a couple analysts with a project manager. You may have dozens of participants. You may have hundreds or even thousands of impactants. As a class, they typically have less consensus around anything, just because of the law of numbers, because it's a bigger group of individuals. Here's what I know about impactants. Impactants shouldn't be in your project meetings. That's what email is for. Impactants, maybe some, but most of them, you communicate with them. You remember the RACI diagram? I think everybody in the world has understood RACI, R-A-C-I. Who's responsible, who's accountable, which is usually a single human being, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. So I almost forgot that one. I want you to think about those. The consulted and the informed. The consulted, you meet with them before your project status meetings. The informed, you send them an email about the status. Don't let them in your meetings and just bog them down. That's actually a model that I use. I've taken RACI and put it into my brain as a mental model. And I've more than once on projects had to disinvite people that I categorize as C's and I's. I've disinvited them because they keep showing up. And they don't say anything in the meeting, but then they send emails by the hundreds after the meeting. And they just mess things up and impede progress. I probably should put that, this probably should be the fourth mental model, except almost everybody's been exposed to RACI. So impactants are important because in a sense, they're your customers. But if I'm going to design an ATM network worldwide, I need to understand what the customers need, but I don't need to have every single customer worldwide informing me of how to build the system, because they don't have the skills, the capabilities in the background. If they did, they'd be on the project. Leaders and champions. Now, leaders and champions are very few in number. Again, if you had, 3 or 4 people up in the top part of this Venn diagram in the project management and analyst, And if you had dozens in the participants and hundreds or thousands in the impactants, leaders and champions, you probably have 2 to 4. Leaders and champions hold influential roles. Sometimes they're called sponsors. But here's what's really important. They're the people in your company that by making a comment at the water cooler or the coffee pot, the communal coffee pot, they can get people going in the right or the wrong direction. They can encourage people to move forward, or they can stop progress. So they can breathe life into a change or breathe life into a project. They can also erode or undermine the efforts. So it's really, really important to get the leaders and champions understood. We actually have a methodology. Hopefully in a future Elevate program, we'll be able to come back with some actual methodologies behind these. We have a methodology on projects. I haven't done a project since 1984 where I haven't done an evaluation of who's my analysts, who are my participants, who's my impactants, and who are my leaders and champions. And the reason for that is when I sell the benefits of the project or I deliver the information about the progress, I'm delivering it typically in 4 different ways. Well, 3, because the analyst team kind of self-delivers. But I'm talking to the participants differently than I'm talking to the impactants, and I'm talking to leaders and champions. This is why on major projects, in my business, we've always been advocates of there's a person, a project manager managing the project, and there's a project manager managing the client. Because our job is to manage the client and to make sure that they are informed appropriately, that they understand what's going on. There's no bad news hidden. It's all good news, and bad news has equal weight, but they're not interfering with the project. They're not getting into the project. And that's all about communication and appropriate communication. I had a consultant working for me a number of years ago, and he said, look, the client says the weekly status reports, the leadership team doesn't, they said, we don't need them every Friday. We can do them less often than that. What should we do? And I said, well, frankly, nothing. And if it's up to me, I would do them twice a week now. And the reason for that is no project manager, to my knowledge, has ever been fired for over communicating. It's as simple and as practical as that. Now, we really didn't double it. We didn't send them out on Wednesday and Fridays, but we didn't stop sending them out on Fridays. And so to the pool of people that needed to have them. So leaders and champions, you have to spend a lot of time with them, and you have to make sure that they understand what's going on. So I want you to think about this. If you really understood who the leaders and champions were, you would spend the appropriate amount of time providing the information to them and seeking their decisions that they would need to have, and then protecting them against decisions they don't need to be making. And the same thing with impactors. You would be polling them, but you wouldn't be bringing them in to do work, nor would you be bringing them in individually for an opinion. Collective opinions are important, but the individual, because again, if you have 5,000 impactants, think back again to a major systems implementation. Everybody's comment, everybody's input is important, but the collective input from the impactants starts to help you understand about the magnitude of the problem. Now, don't take that to be, something like we had years ago in a NASA environment where there was, people just didn't want to say something that might stop a launch. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is being able to manage the important things and to be able to streamline so you're not chasing the trivial many in order to run the important few. So this is why, by the way, another reason why project managers are mini CEOs. For all of you who are managing projects and listening to this, I want you to understand you are special human beings. And I'm not just saying that. You really are special human beings. This is an incredibly important role that you play. I mean, it's better than being a manager or a leader in the company in some ways, because there's a defined beginning, there's a defined end, which means there's defined measurement of success. In some cases, that doesn't exist in leadership. By the way, if you think it does, then you wonder why there's certain executives that get raises even though their stock is sinking. And so we understand project managers have a true accountability in their world. So here's a moment of wisdom. As your experiences in project delivery increase, you are going to discover that of those 4 stakeholders I just talked about, the analysts, the participants, impactants, and leaders and champions, You're going to discover the least important stakeholder in terms of success to the execution is actually you. I mean, you as a project manager, your job is to plan, direct, staff, organize, control, also to inspire, to motivate, to keep people going in a common direction and to achieve results. Surely that's your job, but you can't do that without all the other people. Otherwise, you're just a sole proprietor. You're not an orchestra. You're a single instrument player. And that's not what a project manager is. Project manager is closer to the conductor role than the individual musician role. It only actually matters what they think, really not what you think. And so that's why it's important to understand the participants, the impactants, leaders, and champions, and to understand who they are and manage them appropriately. It takes us to the third and final model, the reactions to change model. The reactions to change model is pretty straightforward. This is about how people respond to change. Now, you've all seen the Kubler-Ross change curve. Everybody has seen this in one way or the other. So over time, the x-axis, over time, we have a problem and people are in denial, and then they go through some realization and then resist and then maybe even become anger, and then eventually they let go, and then they start searching for alternatives. They understand the meaning of the new change and the new alternative, and then they actually implement. Now, let me walk you through this in a little bit different language. Let's imagine that you are implementing a new technology in a factory. You're building a whole new technology that has never existed in the factory before. There's going to be people who go, why should we do this? No one else has ever done this. This is not a best practice. This is bleeding edge. Why should we do this? And they deny that they should be doing this because it's too risky. And then your job is not to beat them into going along and implementing. Your job as a project manager is just to lead them to realization. Just lead them to the next step. It's like I tell people writing resumes. You're looking for a job. The only point of a resume is to get you an interview. That's it. It's not to get a job. It's to get an interview. And you need to be honest and you need to be ethical, but you can do anything you want to do that. I had an architect friend. He got out of college. Right around when I got out of college, and he wanted to go to work with an architect firm. And he realized how incredibly competitive it was. So what he did is he built an origami sort of house resume that, to understand him, you got this big folded thing in the mail, and you pulled this wall up and it told you who he was with a picture. And you then folded this wall up, and then you did it. And by the time the person who received this in the mail was done, they had a whole house that they just constructed with, by the way, interior walls as well as exterior walls and a roof and a chimney, that all led them to understand the guy was turning interviews away because he understood it was to get an interview, not to get a job. And so you have to walk them from denial to realization. Once you walk them from realization, then you need to walk them to letting go, and you have to deal with the anger and the blame and all of that and the resistance, and it's too hard to do, those kinds of things. Once you get past the yellow letting go, then they start to get excited. Look, everybody loves to search for solutions. I haven't met a team of human beings that I can't get into a room and get them excited about talking about alternate solutions. They will talk about alternate solutions and forget about blaming pretty fast. It's amazing how fast that happens, but you have to work at it. You can't take them from realization to understanding the change. You've got to walk them through every step. So if you understand that, then there's another way of looking at this is to realize that people respond to any change you're going to propose one of three ways: rational, emotional, or political. This rational change within a business enterprise happens when people are motivated to action. They are accepting of facts. They buy into analysis. They're inspired by open and compelling dialogue, or they agree to change as it makes rational sense. So it turns out the rational reaction to change just doesn't happen that often. This is what's really important. I just read to you virtually all the words there. And now I'm going to tell you, it just doesn't happen that often. Rational reaction to change is far and few between, but you do get some people. So example, I'm going to redesign the entire maintenance function in my company, in my factory and equipment maintenance. I'm going to redesign that, and we're going to outsource all the mechanical work. And all the mechanics are sitting around going, really? Really? But there's one mechanic that comes forward and goes, I know my job is going to be over here, but this makes a lot of sense to me. This is the rational. Come on, folks. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. So the rational reaction to change within a business is something we aspire to, but that's why we're project managers. That's why we're project analysts. That's why we're leaders of companies. Our job is to try to make those things that are emotional and political more rational. So we have to understand, you can't just take the numbers and have stand on the pallet meeting in the factory or stand on the desk in the engineering department and give a speech and expect everybody to accept it rationally. And I don't care if you have a high school education, a college education, a graduate education, a PhD, a postdoc work, or a CEO of a company. Not all people are going to rationally react. It has nothing to do with education and background. It has to do with the next two issues, which is emotional and political. Emotional and political always overcomes rational, unfortunately. The emotional reaction to change is closely aligned with the perception of the impact of job security. Now, notice I said perception of job security. It doesn't have to have anything to do with real job security. It's just the perception. By the way, it's not even the perception of the reactor's job security. It could be their perception of what it's going to do for Sally or Robert in the cubicle next to them. They may see this as unfair to them. They may know something about their lifestyle and things they're going through that they really don't think it's fair for the company to pile on now with maybe a job change or a layoff or even a promotion. And so emotional reaction to change is closely aligned with one's perception of job security. Now, the political reaction to change is all about power, turf, and influence. This is about how the change that you as a project team or project manager are proposing, how that's going to affect people's power, their turf, or their influence. So if I go back to my idea where I move from a MRP sort of environment where purchasing people are calling the vendors to putting the vendors on replenishment supply and they make those decisions, I might have people inside the purchasing organization who think that's not a good idea, not because it's going to affect their job, but because it affects their influence. It affects it. So think about this. The buyer might be worried about his or her job, but the purchasing manager now says, gosh, I'm going to have 25% fewer people. And so many companies, the amount of people that report to somebody is an underlying value system that people start to actually believe. They think a person with 50 people is more influential than a person with 10 people reporting to them. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And we know that. That's why we have fellowship programs or fellows in the engineering functions and R&D functions. People that are sole proprietors in terms of delivering from their brain to the company's P&L and balance sheets because of what they know and what they do and how smart and how capable they are. So we know that the number of people reporting to you has nothing to do really with power, turf, and influence. It may be the perception of power, turf, and influence. But nevertheless, you have to identify those people. Now, with that said, I'm going to tell you, I have never done a project, again, since 1984, on this without breaking down all the people I have to work with into we sit around in our project team room and okay, when we make this presentation, who's going to want to hear it from a rational perspective? Who is going to emotionally react? Who is going to politically react? And I mean first names, middle initials, and last names. We do that. And we try to understand. Now, with that, there's another thing I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about how you approach these people. You approach these people what we call the change reaction language, or the CRL. In other words, you build a different discussion, a different presentation, a different way of communicating with those individuals. We actually will meet individually. And by the way, those are called pre-presents. And I will tell you this, we never have a solution set that we go into a big room and talk to a broad audience. without having talked to each of them individually, or at least in very, very small groups before that. Everybody says, well, that's just terribly inefficient. Well, let me give you another kind of moment of wisdom here that's not, I don't think, in the course or the materials here, but here's one. Change management and efficiency don't belong in the same sentence. There's no way of efficiently changing people. There's no way of efficiently changing individuals. You have to work through their change language, or the reaction language, or change reaction language. Okay, so I want you to think about this. Change reaction language is driven by participants in a proposed change, not by the change agent. So I have to know who is going to be worried about their job. I have to know who's going to be worried about their power, turf, and influence. I have to know who's going to want the numbers and the details and the background. Failure to properly identify a participant, an impacted, a leader, and a champion, and to understand who's going to be emotionally reactive and who's going to be politically reactive, is going to cause you an enormous amount of problems. Basically, half of the people will not hear a thing you say. Nothing you say will resonate. It'll be words in, nothing out. Nothing going around in their brain. They will not hear. And so it turns out that failure to properly identify a participant, an impactant, a leader, and a champion, as well as another layer of who's going to react emotionally and who's going to react politically, guarantees you 50% or more of the people simply won't hear you. So it turns out the CRL really kind of is a kickstart to the S-curve. Remember the S-curve? The S-curve is how projects pick up. They create momentum, and then they start to peak, and then they kind of stabilize. So the CRL is what helps you get past the start of that S-curve as fast as possible. That's not just theory. That's reality. In other words, when you do a project, you have to sit down, and I don't care if that spreadsheet of names is 10 people long for those groups of participants, impactants, leaders, and champions, and political and emotional reactants. I don't care if it's 10 names long or 1,000 names long. This is the hard work of project management. At Caltech, we have a robot lab, and we have this wonderful professor by the name of Dr. Aaron Ames. Aaron Ames has really been focused a lot of years on robotic motion. And he keeps saying this. Robots, the motion side of robots is about math. And it's the hard work of building the algorithms for all the required motions and the nuanced motions and the thousands and thousands and thousands of algorithms with the millions of data points. He says that's just the hard work that's required to make robots move effectively. It's about math. And those that shortcut that don't get the end result that they want. So here's a moment of wisdom for all of you. It is delusional to believe that any more than a slim minority of internal opposition or opposition stakeholders will react primarily from a rational position. It doesn't make any difference how rational it is. It's delusional to imagine those that are politically and emotionally reactive are going to be swayed. Get used to focusing most of your interactions on the emotional, which is about employment security or perceived employment security for the person or their colleagues, and the political, which is the power, turf, and influences for both the people. And whereas emotional reactives generally focused on perceptions of anybody, the reactive person or other people around them, the political reaction is almost always the individual person themselves. So the political reactors don't worry as much about how it's going to affect the power, turf, or influence of somebody else in the organization. So in summary, there's your three models. 1, impediments decomposition model. 2, constituents of change model. And 3, reactions to change model. We have a typo there, by the way, on that one. Shouldn't say relational, should say rational. So those are your three models, and you should never forget those. Those should be used forever. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. Mike, I think you wanted to open it up for some Q&A, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, this is incredible. Thank you. Just a reflection before I get to a couple of the questions. This is really grounded in psychology and sociology, behavioral sciences. I'm kind of biased because my undergrad was sociology and business. Um, One of my first questions is as a project manager, how much do my team members need to know these things? What's a good way to have them know what I know?
Yeah.
And then, does that spread the love work?
Wow. I've known you, Mike, for I don't know how long now, and I didn't know that you were like a sociologist. Man, I would have picked a different subject, like 3 easy steps to calculating the Wagner-Wigum algorithms. But okay, so good point, good question you asked. Yeah, I think you should spread the love. Absolutely spread the love. I think it's important for the close network of project people working on your project team. Remember, as a project leader, if you in fact buy into my logic that you're a miniature CEO, a CEO's job is to develop people, then you're supposed to develop them. I cannot imagine any harm happening. There's languages, Mike, and there's languages of collegiality. So one of the things we teach all of our people all the time is that big, that terrible short word that has huge impact, the one that's called but, usually followed by, but let me tell you, or let me give you. So instead of the word but, we always tell people, find something that someone who disagrees with you, find something in their string of disagreement, some little minuscule thing, if possible, that you can agree with and build on that. And so your language, when somebody says something you don't agree with, should be, let me build on that, not but let me. Because when you say to somebody but, that just says, right, I'm erasing everything you just said. And so from a behavioral perspective, it's good to have project team members who know how to interact with emotional and political reactors to change. I can't think of any negative that would come from educating them in that.
Yes, and good segue. One of our questions that came in was, could you go back over the CRL, the change reaction language? What exactly is that?
Yeah, so change reaction language is very simple. Once you understand the person that's going to respond likely from an emotional perspective, that is closely, their reaction is going to be aligned with their perception of the impact of this change on their job security or people's job security that they care about, colleagues. Once you understand that, then that means you put together a message that's very clear, so there's no ambiguity about how things are going to change, including around employment. So the worst, if you think about what are people usually afraid of, they're not afraid of change. What they're afraid of is unknown change. And so one of the ways of bringing them along is to say, look, it's very likely that your role will change, and here are the reasons why. And you've been here your team's been here X number of years. We're going to try to find a place. So you have to be very clear about what your intentions are. But and by the way, if there is no use for them in the future, which is a terrible thing that managers have to occasionally deal with, but these are things that we as managers and leaders do. You still have to be very clear about it, and you have to provide them a path to participate, which means you don't walk into that meeting with them without having done your homework, having talked with HR, having talked with other people. Because if these people are going to have to leave at some point in time, you need to give them incentive, whether it's economic incentive or other job opportunities. You have to give them that incentive to stay and to continue to work and to do their job appropriately. So if it's a political reaction change, if you identify this person as, they're going to just say no because they're losing people and that they think that reduces their power, turf, and influence. That means you need to spend a lot of time with them to get them to understand that number of people reporting to them or the corner office, or whether they have a plant or a window in their office, has nothing to do with how the company perceives them and how their colleagues perceive them. And so power, turf, and influence, one's view of how much power and influence they have is almost always, except for the best, most skilled project managers and leaders in companies, almost always has some defects in how they got there. And so again, if you'd be intrigued by why does this person think they run a purchasing department of 45 people? Why do they think that they're that important? Well, it's because they spend $1.2 billion a year. It's because they, have to manage things worldwide. And so, okay, so we can understand why they think that they're that powerful. Now, let's try to figure out how to get them to understand that they're just one gear in a whole gear of people from sales and from R&D and others. And so we may have to put off having a discussion with them until we can get them to a point where they actually understand. And this is what we talk. I mean, our CRL is really about, our change reactive language is getting them to understand that they, in fact, need to be thinking of themselves as a gear in an overall power transmission, if you will. It's like one of my friends said to me, he says, using a transmission, a mechanical auto transmission as an example. He said, look, power in is one thing, power out is a whole other thing. And so, if you think about a transmission, all these gears have to mesh, and at all times they're all still in proximity, and somebody has to shift it, or the system shifts it, but they have to still all find a way to work together. And so you have to spend some time getting that person to understand. And this is tough, especially when you have what we call careerists, whose main concern every day is not the mission of the unit or the mission of the company or the mission of the department, but it's their own personal ambitions. And we've all met those people. And we've all met, and unfortunately, sometimes they've, over years, have bullied their ways into certain positions. And we've all worked with those kinds of people. And you can change those kinds of people, but it takes some work, and trying to get them to do something that's going to, in their mind, reduce their power turf or influences, probably not going to work. I've actually had clients who've taken those people and transferred them before the implementation of whatever, both as a way of getting the project implemented, and secondly, trying to put them in a place where they're uncomfortable, where they don't have as much power. And so this is a leader's job, is to put people in uncomfortable positions once in a while and see if they rise to the occasion. So
yeah, I love that. That's a great answer. As part of the yes and I think when people are locked in on, do I have an audience that is really driven by deductive logic, like A, B, then therefore C, that requires a little bit different communication than others who could be persuaded by different forms, right? We still have almost everybody with us. We will be giving the recording of this out to everybody. We'll send the deck. If you have other questions, let us know. We'll still have time. We're kind of flexible that way, I believe. Any other questions from folks? Well, I think, yeah, we should do a future second part to this that is all about the methodology. I think understanding communications, whether it's part of the elevated series or separate. It is top of the hour. It's a little bit over. We really thank everybody for being here. We know your time is precious. Next month, September 21st, we'll have Galina Notman, who teaches leadership and executive coaching at Caltech. She'll be a part of this. Thank you again, Alan. Thank you for being here, Rick. And have a great afternoon, everyone. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.